Lew Welch, Phil Whalen, and myself were all students at Reed College in the late 40s, and that's where we first made contact and also first started writing poetry together. Jim Hatch, the photographer who did the cover here, was also at Reed at that time. And so like as Elaine was just saying, there are many circles, many connections that reach a long ways, go back a long ways. Tonight, everybody is doing self-introductions, partly to save time, and people will be coming up one after another, telling you who they are, a few words about their connections with Lew and his work, and reading maybe a poem or two that they have chosen from Lew's work, maybe something of their own work that throws light on it all. And I'm not sure if everybody said they were going to come is even here yet. Is Peter Coyote here? Peter didn't get here yet. Oh well. And we'll finish up, and then there'll be a little signing in back of, or purchasing in back of the book. And I guess I'm going to, since I'm the guy that wrote the foreword, I'll sign the foreword. Otherwise, that's it. But I'm looking to see, if there's a guy who looks like Lew Welch in this audience. It's always a possibility. The foreword to the book, I get to read that because I wrote it. It will soon be half a century, since Lew Welch left his car and his camp and his plans and walked off into the wilds of the northern Sierra. This book of his poems, Ring of Bone, was first published soon after that. He was 45 years old then. Lew was a handsome, talented, charismatic man who spoke eloquently on many topics, a humanist by education, whose first prose writings, his own first prose writings, were on Richard Stein. He was one of a set of 4 poets in the late 40s who were students at Reed up in Portland together. Phil Whalen, Lew, Gary Snyder, the experimentalist, William Dickey, the brilliant formalist, who taught for years out of San Francisco State. Whalen, Snyder, and Welch regrouped in the Bay Area in the late 40s and participated in the San Francisco Renaissance, the beat literary scene. Hey, Michael, there's some seats over here for you guys.
All right.
Good.
All right. Michael and Thur, sir.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah. Now what we need is Peter Kyger. And everybody that I expected is here. Don Allen and his Four Seasons Press inherited Lew's literary archive and published or republished 8 books and chapbooks by Lew. Ring of Bone is the major volume of poems, and since the smaller selected poems is long out of print, I will quote some of the preface that I wrote then. What we recognize as poetry, different from rock lyrics, say, carries a large body of cultural and archetypal lore in loops from the past, also aiming into the future. The poems in Ring of Bone have an underlying drone tone like the tambura of Indian music, a rich, basic Asian and Occidental humane grounding. Lew writes lyrical poems of clarity, humor, and dark probings. The poems brought together in this selection are the major works of a man who, of his 45 years of life in the West, gave 21 to poetry. His work stands in the context of San Francisco poetry renaissance, the post-World War II libertarian energy of striving to further develop the possibilities of open-form poetry. And in those days, in the late 40s and in the 50s, even in the 60s, the word libertarian did not mean some kind of right-winger. It was used as a term for an anarchist. So there are right libertarians and left libertarians. That's the way we figure it out now. The heart of the book is the Hermit Poems and the Way Back sections. Poems evoking, covering time spent in retreat and practice at a cabin in the mountains of the coastal northern California, deep up the rivers that are still Yurok land. In those works, Lew achieved the meetings of an ancient sage tradition and the shack-simple post-frontier backcountry working man's style, and then the elite rebel modernism of art. He returned to the Bay Area at the inception of the over-heavy flowering of hippie culture. It is instructive how these poems have the essence, but cut through the psychedelic baroque. The title Ring of Bone comes from one of his poems. It was written, we are told, in 1963 when he was living and writing up the Salmon River, pulling together lines and thoughts from a letter to Robert Duncan that was never sent. It is part of the Hermit Poems series. As for poetics, jazz musical phrasing of American speech is one of Lew Welch's clearest contributions. First clued in to write in natural speech and in terms of the musical phrase by William Carlos Williams and Desert Bound, he turns sometimes to street talk, street jive, blues, pop rhythm, and can score it on the page. It is done without cuteness or obscurity. Indeed, all of these poems have music and clarity of language, and a compression such that the words stop, but the meaning keeps going on. His reading of Chinese poetry and Japanese haiku in translation sharpened eye and ear, but led to imitation only when in fun. Behind and informing the playfulness and skill of these poems is the evolving consciousness of a man who struggled to be on the way. He is one of the few who saw the beauty of that ecstatic mutual offering called by biologists and ecologists the food chain. My late wife, Carol Koda, once said that the basic practice of her Jodo Shin sect Buddhist upbringing, the school of Buddhism which astutely critiques the effort of yogins and yoginis and Zen-type ascetics to improve themselves, that the Jodo Shin practice was church potlucks down in the Sacramento Valley where she grew up. But Lew was finally brought down by his addiction to alcohol. He and I worked on his addiction together one time, both of us taking LSD and sitting at the edge of the ridge top up above the hamlet of Stinson Beach. That's where he first really saw the vultures and called them to himself, and then said, almost in despair, "I'm not edible." I was off in my own study of a dancing, blinding baby Krishna, and then I discovered my sense of smell. We did not solve Lew's drinking problems, but after that day, I never smoked tobacco again. Poets learn a lot from witches. Living with the image of the Teeth Mother was the darker side of Lew's songs. He not only drank too much, he had a way with guns, and took one with him into the woods, never to be seen again, in May of 1971. Now I want to clear up the record because I keep reading different guns of different types that people make up, I guess, as they are writing about it. The gun he took with him was a large frame Smith & Wesson stainless steel revolver cartridged for a .22. Lew's memory and mystery lives on. In the spring of 2011, that's just a year ago, the Central Library of Los Angeles, really the person of Louise Steinman, sponsored a gathering of several people and writers who had known Lew, and we were all surprised by the size and enthusiasm of the crowds that came. People of all ages. City Lights Books took over Lew's work after Don Allen's death. And in 2011, all of Lew's books were out of print. The Los Angeles celebration of his work was push enough to get us to a new edition of Ring of Bone. This bright-eyed bardic spirit, Lew Welch, still wandering and singing on the back roads, I imagine, at the far edge of the West, will be with us for a long time. As Lew also wrote, guard the mysteries, constantly reveal them. Mystery. The life of art, though poets are always complaining, is without equal. There is nothing to regret. And now I will introduce Joanne Kyger, who will introduce herself, who knew quite well indeed, and she's going to do a selection of readings from his poems. Joanne.